He braved a hail of arrows for the western lass. Her heart was his prize. The sun hung low over the jagged horizon, painting the Wyoming plains in shades of amber and crimson. Dust swirled in lazy spirals kicked up by the restless hooves of a lone rider. Amos Tucker, a man carved from the hard edges of the Wild West, swayed gently in his saddle, his weathered hat tilted against the glare. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the endless stretch of scrub and sagebrush. He was no stranger to the dangers of these lands, bandits, rattlers, and storms that could swallow a man whole. But today something else stirred in the air, a whisper of trouble that set his nerves alight. Amos wasn't born a hero. He'd tell you that himself with a gruff laugh and a sip of whiskey to chase the words. He was a drifter, a man with no roots, moving from one dusty town to the next, chasing bounties and dodging ghosts. His hands were calloused from years of roping steers and pulling triggers, his face etched with lines that told stories he'd rather forget. But beneath the grit and the squint, there was a heart that hadn't quite hardened, a spark that refused to die. And that spark was about to meet its match. In the distance, a speck of a town shimmered like a mirage. Sagebrush Hollow, they called it, a place where dreams went to wither and men went to drink. Amos had no business there, not really. He was just passing through, his saddlebags light and his pockets lighter. But as he neared the town's edge, a sound cut through the stillness. A woman's scream, sharp and desperate, followed by the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire. Amos spurred his horse Rusty toward the commotion. The scream had come from the direction of the old stagecoach trail, a winding path notorious for ambushes. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, fingers itching with instinct. He didn't know who was in trouble, but he'd never been one to turn his back on a cry for help. Not since that day years ago when he'd failed someone he loved. The memory stung, but he pushed it down, focusing on the dust cloud rising ahead. As he crested a low hill, the scene unfolded like a nightmare painted in broad daylight. A stagecoach lay tilted on its side, one wheel shattered, its canvas cover torn to ribbons. 3 men on horseback circled it like vultures, their faces masked by bandanas, rifles glinting in the sun. A 4th man, dismounted, was dragging a woman from the wreckage. Her brown hair spilled loose from its pins, catching the light like polished mahogany, and her eyes, Lord, those eyes burned with a mix of fear and defiance. Delilah Rose, though Amos didn't know her name yet, was no damsel content to cower. "Get your hands off me, you filthy dog," she spat, swinging a fist that caught the bandit square in the jaw. He staggered, cursing, but his grip tightened, and he raised a hand to strike her. That was when Amos made his move. "Hey!" His voice boomed across the clearing, low and commanding, like thunder rolling over the plains. The bandits froze their heads, snapping toward him. Amos dismounted, slow and deliberate, his boots crunching against the dry earth. "Let the lady go, and maybe I won't send you boys to meet your maker." The leader, a wiry man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow, sneered. "You're outnumbered, stranger. Ride on, or you'll be buzzard food by sundown." Amos didn't flinch. He'd heard threats like that before, and he'd outlived most of the men who'd made them. His hand hovered over his revolver, steady as stone. "Last chance," he said, his voice calm, but laced with steel. The bandits laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed off the rocks. The leader raised his rifle, and that was all the signal Amos needed. In a blur, his revolver was out, the barrel flashing as he fired. The leader's hat flew off a neat hole, punched through its brim, and he stumbled back, clutching his grazed shoulder. The other 2 bandits swung their rifles toward Amos, but he was already moving, diving behind a boulder as bullets kicked up dirt around him. Delilah seized her moment. With a cry, she drove her knee into the groin of the man holding her, sending him howling to the ground. She scrambled toward the stagecoach, grabbing a fallen pistol from the dust. Amos caught her eye for a split second, and something passed between them, a silent understanding, a spark of trust in the chaos. "Stay down," Amos shouted, popping up to fire 2 more shots. One bandit's horse reared, throwing its rider, while the other took a bullet to the leg and crumpled. The leader, recovering, bellowed a curse and charged toward Amos, drawing a wicked-looking Bowie knife. Amos met him head-on, ducking under the blade's arc and driving his fist into the man's gut. The bandit doubled over, gasping, but swung wildly, slicing a shallow gash across Amos's forearm. Pain flared, but Amos ignored it, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting until the knife fell. A swift knee to the chin sent the bandit sprawling out cold. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader down, fled into the scrub, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Amos stood breathing hard, his arms stinging, where blood seeped through his torn sleeve. He turned to Delilah, who was still clutching the pistol, her chest heaving, her eyes wide but steady. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, holstering his revolver. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thanks to you," she said, her voice soft but firm like a river running over smooth stones. "I thought I was done for." Amos tipped his hat, a small gesture that felt oddly formal in the aftermath of the brawl. "Just doing what's right," he said. But as he looked at her, those fierce, beautiful eyes, that unyielding spirit, something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the thrill of the fight or the rush of danger. It was her. Delilah stepped closer, inspecting the cut on his arm. "You're hurt," she said, concern creasing her brow. "Let me patch that up. It's the least I can do." Amos waved her off, but she was already tearing a strip from her petticoat, her movements quick and sure. As she wrapped the cloth around his wound, her fingers brushed his skin, and he felt a jolt like a spark from a flint. She didn't seem to notice, focused on her task, but Amos couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this dusty trail in the middle of nowhere, was the start of something bigger. "Who are those men?" he asked, nodding toward the unconscious bandit. Delilah's jaw tightened. "Caleb Kane's gang. They've been terrorizing the trails around here for months. I was on my way to Sagebrush Hollow to visit my brother when they hit the stagecoach." Amos frowned. Caleb Kane was a name that carried weight in these parts, a ruthless outlaw with a knack for slipping through the law's fingers. If Kane's men were after Delilah, she was in more danger than a single ambush. "You got a place to stay in town?" he asked. "My brother's ranch just outside Sagebrush," she said, "but I don't know if it's safe now. Kane's got a grudge against my family." Amos didn't hesitate. "I'll ride with you," he said. "Make sure you get there in one piece." Delilah studied him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the story behind his scars. "Why help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." He shrugged, a half smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I'm just tired of riding alone." She laughed, a sound like bells in the wind, and for the first time in a long while, Amos felt something like hope. The road to Sagebrush Hollow stretched ahead, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But as they mounted their horses and rode side by side, he knew one thing for certain: he'd face whatever came next, as long as it meant keeping her safe. The sun dipped lower, its dying light casting long shadows across the Wyoming plains, as Amos Tucker and Delilah Rose rode toward Sagebrush Hollow. The air was thick with the scent of sage and the faint tang of gunpowder still lingering from the fight. Rusty's hooves thudded steadily beneath Amos, a rhythm that matched the quiet beat of his heart, though he'd never admit how it quickened when Delilah glanced his way. Her brown hair, now tied back with a scrap of ribbon, swayed with the motion of her horse, and those eyes, sharp, soulful, and a little too knowing, seemed to see right through him. He kept his gaze on the trail, but her presence was like a warm wind, impossible to ignore. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the wrecked stagecoach behind. The bandit Amos had knocked out was tied to a tree left for the law to deal with, though Amos doubted any sheriff would venture this far into Kane's territory. Delilah rode with a quiet determination, her pistol tucked into the waistband of her skirt, her posture straight despite the ordeal she just endured. She was no fragile flower, that much was clear, and yet there was a softness to her, a warmth that made Amos want to know more than he had any right to. "You ever been to Sagebrush before?" Delilah's voice broke the silence light, but curious, pulling him from his thoughts. Amos tilted his hat back, squinting at the horizon. Once or twice. Ain't much to it, saloon general store, and a whole lot of folks minding their own business. She smiled, a small curve of her lips that lit up her face like a sunrise. Sounds like you don't stay long in places like that. Places like that don't stay long with me, he said, his voice rougher than he meant. I move where the wind takes me. Delilah's eyes flickered with something amusement, maybe, or understanding. The wind, huh, must get lonely chasing it all the time. He didn't answer right away, letting the word settle. Lonely. It was a word he'd buried deep along with memories of a life he'd left behind. But something about her made him want to dig it up, to let her see the man beneath the dust and scars. Instead, he shrugged. Ain't so bad. Keeps me out of trouble. She laughed soft and bright, and the sound stirred something in him like a melody he'd forgotten. Trouble seems to find you just fine, Amos Tucker. He couldn't help but grin, a rare thing that felt foreign on his face. Maybe I let it find me today. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. The creak of leather, the soft snort of the horses, the vast open sky above. But the moment shattered as a distant rumble echoed across the plains. Amos's hand went to his revolver, his senses sharpening. Delilah tensed beside him, her hand hovering near her pistol. Riders, Amos said, his voice low. He nodded toward a ridge where a cloud of dust was rising, too big for just one or two horses. Could be Cain's men looking for payback. Delilah's face hardened, but there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. They don't give up easy, do they? Not when they've got a score to settle. Amos scanned the terrain, his mind racing. The trail to Sagebrush Hollow was open and exposed, no cover for miles, except a narrow gully a half-mile ahead. We need to move. Fast. They spurred their horses into a gallop, the wind whipping past as the rumble grew louder. Amos glanced back, catching glimpses of dark shapes cresting the ridge. 6 riders, maybe more, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. His gut told him this wasn't just a chase. Cain's gang didn't ride this hard unless they meant blood. The gully came into view, a jagged scar in the earth, lined with scrub and boulders. Amos pointed. There, we can hold them off from cover. Delilah nodded, her jaw set, and they veered off the trail, their horses scrambling down the rocky slope. They dismounted behind a cluster of boulders, tying the horses to a stunted tree. Amos checked his revolver, counting the bullets in the cylinder. 6 shots and a handful more in his belt. Delilah crouched beside him, her pistol ready, her breathing steady despite the danger closing in. You know how to use that thing? Amos asked, nodding at her gun. She raised an eyebrow, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Grew up with 3 brothers. I can shoot the wings off a fly at 20 paces. He chuckled despite the tension. Remind me not to get on your bad side. The riders were closer now, their shouts carrying on the wind. Amos peeked over the boulder, counting 8 men, their bandanas pulled down to reveal hard-weathered faces. One of them, a broad-shouldered brute with a red beard, barked orders, pointing toward the gully. Amos recognized him from wanted posters. Red Jack Cain's right-hand man, a killer with a taste for cruelty. They're coming straight for us, Amos whispered. Stay low and don't shoot till I do. Delilah nodded, her eyes locked on the approaching riders. Amos felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that came before a fight when the world slowed, and every detail sharpened, the glint of a spur, the creak of a saddle, the way Delilah's fingers tightened around her pistol. He didn't know her story, not yet, but he knew she was no stranger to standing her ground. The riders slowed as they neared the gully, spreading out to flank it. Red Jack raised a hand, signaling them to stop. Come on out, Tucker, he bellowed, his voice like gravel. We know you're in there, and we got no quarrel with you. Hand over the girl and you walk away. Amos's jaw tightened. He glanced at Delilah, expecting fear, but her eyes blazed with fury. They're after me because of my brother, she whispered. He crossed Cain, and now they want to make an example. Amos nodded, his mind made up. They ain't getting you, he said, his voice low but firm. Not today. He rose just enough to aim over the boulder, his revolver steady. "Red Jack," he called. "You want the lady, you'll have to come through me first." A tense silence followed, broken only by the snort of a horse. Then Red Jack laughed a cold, mirthless sound. "Have it your way, Tucker. Boys flush 'em out." The air exploded with gunfire bullets ricocheting off the boulders as Amos and Delilah ducked low. Amos fired back his shots, precise, dropping one rider from his saddle. Delilah leaned out her pistol, barking, and another man clutched his shoulder, cursing as he fell. The gully became a chaos of smoke and noise, the sharp crack of guns mingling with the shouts of men and the screams of wounded horses. Amos moved like a man possessed, his years of surviving in the Wild West guiding his every step. He grabbed Delilah's arm, pulling her to a new position behind a larger rock as bullets tore through the air where they'd been. "We can't stay pinned down," he said, reloading quickly. "They'll circle around and cut us off." Delilah's eyes darted to the far end of the gully where a narrow path snaked up toward higher ground. "If we can get to that ridge, we might have a chance," she said. "There's a trail to my brother's ranch from there." Amos nodded, his mind racing. It was a gamble, but staying here was a death sentence. "On my signal, we run for it," he said. "Ready." She met his gaze, her eyes fierce and unwavering. "Ready." He counted to 3 in his head, then fired a volley to keep the bandits' heads down. "Now," he shouted, and they bolted, scrambling up the rocky path as bullets whizzed past. Delilah moved with a grace that belied the danger, her skirt catching on thorns, but never slowing her down. Amos stayed close, his revolver in one hand, his other arm ready to shield her if needed. They reached the ridge, breathless but alive, and ducked behind a cluster of scrub. Below, the bandits were regrouping, their shouts growing angrier. Amos knew they wouldn't give up, not with Cain driving them. But as he looked at Delilah, her face flushed with exertion, her eyes alight with determination, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about her. "We're not out of this yet." He set his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "But I swear, Delilah, I'll get you to that ranch." She reached out her hand, brushing his a fleeting touch that felt like a promise. "I know you will," she said, and in that moment, under the vast, unforgiving sky, Amos Tucker knew he'd brave anything for her. The ridge offered little comfort, its sparse cover of scrub and rock barely shielding Amos Tucker and Delilah Rose from the relentless pursuit below. The Wyoming dusk had deepened, cloaking the plains in a purple haze, but the bandits' shouts still echoed sharp and hungry as they fanned out to hunt their prey. Amos crouched low, his revolver warm in his hand, his eyes scanning the gully where shadows danced like specters. Delilah knelt beside him, her breath quick, but controlled, her pistol glinting faintly in the fading light. Her touch from moments ago lingered in his mind, a spark that fueled his resolve. He'd promised to get her to her brother's ranch, and he'd face hell itself to keep that vow. "They're splitting up," Amos whispered, peering through a gap in the scrub. Red Jack's men moved with purpose too, heading toward the gully's eastern flank. 3 more circling west, their silhouettes ghostly against the twilight. Red Jack himself stood at the center, his red beard catching the last rays of sunlight as he barked orders. Amos's gut twisted. They were being herded, forced toward the open trail where they'd be easy targets. Delilah's eyes, fierce and unyielding, met his. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice low but steady. "They'll pin us down." Amos nodded, his mind racing through options. The trail to the ranch lay beyond, a stretch of open ground, a death trap under gunfire. But to the north, a cluster of jagged rocks rose like the spine of some ancient beast, offering better cover if they could reach it. "Those rocks," he said, pointing. "We move fast and you stay low. It's our best shot." She didn't hesitate, her trust in him unspoken but clear. They slithered through the scrub, keeping to the shadows, the dry earth scraping their knees. The bandits' voices grew closer, their boots crunching on gravel, their curses cutting through the still air. Amos's heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of what was at stake. Delilah wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a fire in his chest, a reason to fight harder than he ever had. They reached the rocks just as a shout rang out. There, Red Jack's voice boomed, followed by the crack of a rifle. A bullet struck the boulder beside Amos, spitting shards of stone that stung his cheek. He pulled Delilah down, shielding her with his body, as more shots rang out the air, alive with the whine of lead. "Stay with me," he growled, his voice rough with urgency. Delilah's eyes blazed not with fear, but with defiance. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, raising her pistol and firing back. Her shot caught a bandit in the arm, sending him sprawling with a yelp. Amos couldn't help but admire her nerve. She was no damsel, no matter how soft her features or how her hair caught the starlight. The bandits closed in their gunfire, relentless, pinning Amos and Delilah behind the rocks. Amos returned fire, each shot deliberate, conserving his dwindling bullets. One man fell clutching his chest, but the others pressed closer, their shadows looming larger. Red Jack's laugh echoed cold and taunting. "You're trapped, Tucker. Give up the girl and I might let you crawl away." Amos's jaw clenched. He glanced at Delilah, her face set with determination, and something snapped inside him. He'd lost too much in his life, family, home, hope to let these men take her. "Keep your head down," he told her, his voice low and fierce. "I'm ending this." Before she could protest, Amos stood exposing himself to the hail of bullets. He fired twice, dropping two bandits in quick succession, their bodies hitting the dirt with dull thuds. Pain seared his shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he didn't flinch, his focus razor sharp. Red Jack charged, a tomahawk raised, his face twisted with rage. Amos dove to the side, the blade whistling past his ear, and tackled the outlaw to the ground. The fight was brutal, a blur of fists and dust. Red Jack was strong, his blows landing like sledgehammers, but Amos fought with a fire he hadn't known he still had. He thought of Delilah, of her courage, of the way her touch had awakened something in him. With a roar, he drove his elbow into Red Jack's jaw, sending the man staggering. A swift kick to the chest sent the outlaw sprawling, his tomahawk skittering across the rocks. But the danger wasn't over. A new sound cut through the chaos, a high whistling shriek that made Amos's blood run cold. Arrows. They rained down from the darkness, their tips glinting as they struck the ground around them. Amos spun his eyes, locking on a new threat, a group of shadowy figures on horseback emerging from the northern ridge. Not bandits. These were different, silent, swift, their bows drawn with deadly precision. "Get down," Amos shouted, throwing himself over Delilah as an arrow grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing blood. She gasped, her hands gripping his shirt, her eyes wide with shock. The bandits, caught off guard, scattered, some falling, as arrows found their marks. Red Jack scrambled to his feet, shouting for his men to retreat, but the attackers were relentless, their arrows a deadly storm. Amos's mind raced. These weren't Cain's men. The precision, the silence. It was the mark of a native war party, likely driven to vengeance by Cain's raids on their lands. But why attack now, and why target both them and the bandits? There was no time to puzzle it out. He pulled Delilah behind a larger boulder, his body a shield as arrows thudded into the rock. "Who are they?" Delilah whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "Don't know," Amos admitted, his breath ragged. "But they ain't here to talk." He checked his revolver, 2 bullets left. His shoulder burned, his arm throbbed, but he pushed the pain aside. Delilah was counting on him, and he'd be damned if he let her down. Then a voice called out from the darkness, low and commanding, in a language Amos didn't understand but recognized as Lakota. The arrows stopped the air, falling eerily silent. Amos risked a glance, seeing a lone rider approach his silhouette, tall and proud against the starlit sky. The man raised a hand and the others held back, their bows still drawn. "He wants to talk," Amos said, his voice cautious. "Stay here." Delilah grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. "You're hurt, Amos." You can, I have to, he said, meeting her eyes. Trust me. She hesitated, then nodded, her hand lingering on his arm before letting go. Amos stood slowly, his hands raised, his revolver tucked into his belt. The rider dismounted, his face half hidden in shadow, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. He spoke again, this time in halting English. You fight Cain's men. Why? Amos kept his voice steady. They're after the woman. I'm protecting her. The man studied him, then glanced at the gully where Red Jack and his remaining men had fled. Cain is our enemy, too. His men burn our camps, steal our horses. You are not like them. Amos nodded, sensing a fragile chance. We just want to get to her brother's ranch. We don't want trouble. The man's gaze shifted to Delilah, who had risen to her knees, her pistol lowered but ready. Something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps. She is strong, he said, like our women. He paused, then gestured to his warriors. We will let you pass, but Cain's men we take. Amos exhaled relief, warring with suspicion. Why help us? The man's face hardened. Cain's blood is our justice. Go now before we change our minds. Amos didn't argue. He helped Delilah to her feet, her eyes searching his face, a mix of awe and worry in her gaze. You're bleeding, she said, touching the gash on his arm. I'll live, he said, forcing a grin. Come on, we've got a ranch to reach. As they retrieved their horses and rode toward the trail, the Lakota warriors melted into the darkness, their pursuit of Cain's men a silent promise of vengeance. Amos felt the weight of Delilah's gaze, her unspoken questions hanging between them. Who was he, this man, who'd brave bullets and arrows for her, and what drove him to risk so much? The answers lay ahead in the dust and danger of the Wild West, where their story was only beginning to unfold. The trail to Delilah's brother's ranch stretched before Amos Tucker and Delilah Rose like a ribbon of dust under the star-strewn Wyoming sky. The night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat of the fight they'd just survived, and the silence felt fragile, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Amos's shoulder ached where the bullet had grazed him, and the arrows cut on his arm stung with every jolt of Rusty's hooves, but he kept his focus on the path ahead. Delilah rode beside him, her face pale but resolute, her brown hair catching the moonlight like a river of silk. The encounter with the Lakota warriors had bought them time, but Amos knew better than to think they were safe. Caleb Cain's shadow loomed large, and men like him didn't let grudges die easy. Delilah broke the silence first, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. You didn't have to do that, stand up to those warriors. Most men would have run. Amos glanced at her, his lips twitching into a half-smile. Most men ain't foolish enough to ride with a woman who shoots better than they do. She laughed, a sound that cut through the tension like a breeze through sagebrush, and for a moment the weight of their situation lifted. You're not half bad yourself, Amos Tucker, she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Though I reckon you'd look better without all that blood on you. He chuckled, rubbing his jaw where stubble scratched his fingers. Ain't exactly got time for a bath, ma'am, unless you're offering to scrub my back. Her cheeks flushed, and she swatted at him playfully, her hand brushing his arm. The touch sent a jolt through him, and he cursed himself for the warmth spreading in his chest. This wasn't the time for such thoughts, not with Cain's men likely regrouping, and the night hiding who knew what dangers. But Delilah's laugh, her fire, it was like a lantern in the dark, guiding him through places he'd long forgotten how to feel. The trail dipped into a shallow valley where the faint glow of lanterns marked the edge of her brother's ranch. The sight should have brought relief, but Amos's instincts prickled. Something was off. The air was too still. The usual sounds of a working ranch, lowing cattle, creaking gates absent. He slowed Rusty, his hand resting on his revolver. You sure your brother's expecting you? He asked, his voice low. Delilah frowned, sensing the shift in his tone. He knew I was coming. Why? Amos nodded toward the ranch. Place is quiet. Too quiet. They dismounted, tying their horses to a gnarled fence post, and crept toward the main house, a sturdy log cabin with a sagging porch. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. Delilah's breath hitched, and Amos put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Inside the cabin smelled of stale smoke and neglect. A table was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and a single lantern flickered weakly on a shelf. Delilah stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jacob," she whispered, her brother's name a plea. Before Amos could stop her, she darted toward a back room, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. He cursed under his breath and followed, his revolver drawn. The room was a mess bed, unmade clothes strewn about, but no sign of Jacob. Delilah's eyes were wide, searching until they landed on a scrap of paper pinned to the wall with a knife. She yanked it free, her hands trembling as she read. "It's from Cain," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "He's got Jacob. Says if I don't turn myself over by dawn, my brother's as good as dead." Amos's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Cain was playing a cruel game, using Jacob as bait to lure Delilah into a trap. He took the note from her, scanning the scrawled words. "Meet at Devil's Crossing," it read. "Come alone or the boy pays." Devil's Crossing was a narrow pass 10 miles north, a perfect spot for an ambush. Amos had seen men die in places like that, their screams swallowed by the rocks. "We'll get him back," Amos said, his voice firm, though doubt gnawed at him. He was one man wounded with a handful of bullets, and a woman who, brave as she was no match for Cain's gang. But looking into Delilah's eyes, those fierce, beautiful eyes, he knew he'd try anyway. Before she could respond, a creak from the porch snapped them to attention. Amos spun, revolver raised, just as a figure stumbled through the doorway. It wasn't a bandit, but a gangly young man with a mop of red hair and a face smeared with dirt. He froze, hands up, eyes wide as saucers. "Don't shoot, I'm just Billy." Delilah's face lit up, relief washing over her. "Billy, you're Jacob's ranch hand." She rushed to him, then stopped short, noticing the bruise blooming on his cheek. "What happened? Where's my brother?" Billy swallowed hard, his voice shaky. "Cain's men came at sundown. Took Jacob, roughed me up, told me to deliver that note. I hid in the barn when I heard horses, thought you was them coming back." Amos lowered his gun but kept his guard up. "How many men?" 10, maybe 12, Billy said, wiping his nose. "They was armed to the teeth, talking about settling scores. Said something about Delilah knowing too much." Delilah's face paled, but her jaw set with determination. "Knowing too much, all I know is Cain's been stealing cattle and burning homesteads. Jacob was gathering proof to take to the marshal." Amos's mind clicked. That explained Cain's vendetta. Jacob must have gotten too close to exposing the outlaws' operation, and now Delilah was the key to keeping that secret buried. "We ain't got much time," Amos said. "Cain'll expect you at Devil's Crossing, but he won't play fair." Delilah nodded, her eyes blazing. "Then we don't play fair either." Billy, still trembling, piped up. There's something else." Jacob hid a strong box in the cellar. Said it had papers that could ruin Cain. "I ain't looked, but maybe it's worth checking." Amos and Delilah exchanged a glance. The strong box could be their leverage or a death sentence if Cain got to it first. They followed Billy to a trap door behind the kitchen, the air growing damp and musty as they descended into the cellar. Billy fumbled with a lantern, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "Careful, kid," Amos muttered. "You're jumpier than a jackrabbit in a snake pit." Delilah stifled a laugh, the sound breaking the tension. "He's right, Billy. You're making me nervous." Billy blushed, muttering an apology as he lit the lantern. The cellar was cramped, filled with barrels and sacks of grain, but in the corner, half buried under a pile of burlap, was a small iron strongbox. Delilah knelt, brushing dirt from its surface, her fingers tracing a lock. "It's Jacob," she said, "but I don't have the key." Amos crouched beside her, inspecting the lock. "Don't need a key when you've got a bullet. He aimed his revolver, but Delilah grabbed his arm, her touch warm and urgent. Wait. You'll draw every bandit within 10 miles. He grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. Fair point. Got a hairpin. She raised an eyebrow, then plucked one from her hair, handing it to him with a smirk. Didn't peg you for a lockpicker, Tucker. There's a lot you don't know about me, he said, winking as he bent the hairpin and set to work. The lock was stubborn, but Amos's hands were steady, years of less than honest work in his youth coming in handy. The click of the tumblers felt like a small victory. Inside the strong box were papers, ledgers, letters, and a map marked with Kane's hideouts. Delilah's eyes widened as she scanned them. This is it, she whispered. Proof of everything, cattle rustling payoffs to crooked sheriffs. Jacob was going to take this to Cheyenne. Amos's gut twisted. This was why Kane wanted her dead. She wasn't just a witness. She was a threat to his empire. We need to get these to the marshal, he said. But first we get your brother. As they climbed out of the cellar, Billy, trailing nervously behind a new sound, froze them in their tracks. Hooves too close, thundering toward the ranch. Amos doused the lantern, pulling Delilah into the shadows of the cabin. Kane's men, he whispered. They're early? Delilah clutched the strong box, her eyes fierce. They're not getting this. Or us. Amos nodded, his hand on his revolver, his heart pounding not just for the fight ahead, but for the woman beside him. She was trouble sure as the sun rose, but she was the kind of trouble worth fighting for. As the hoofbeats grew louder, he leaned close, his voice a low rumble. Stick with me, Delilah. We'll give 'em a show they won't forget. She met his gaze, a smile tugging at her lips despite the danger. Lead the way, cowboy. The thunder of hooves grew louder, a relentless drumbeat that vibrated through the wooden floor of the darkened cabin, where Amos, Tucker, and Delilah Rose crouched in the shadows. The strong box, heavy with Jacob's damning evidence against Caleb Kane, was tucked under Delilah's arm, her grip fierce, as if it were her brother himself. Amos's hand rested on his revolver, his eyes locked on the sliver of moonlight seeping through the cracked door, where the silhouettes of approaching riders flickered like ghosts. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel stolen. But beneath it, something else simmered, a current between Amos and Delilah, unspoken but electric, born from the danger they'd faced together and the trust that had grown in its wake. Billy Amos whispered, his voice low and urgent. Get to the barn. Bar the door and stay quiet. We'll handle this. The young ranch hand nodded, his face pale as he scurried toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the night. Delilah's eyes met Amos's, her gaze steady despite the fear that lingered there. What's the plan? She asked, her voice soft but resolute. Amos's lips curved into a grim smile. We draw him away from the house, keep that strong box safe, and get to higher ground. There's a ridge behind the barn, good cover. I'll hold him off. Her brow furrowed, a spark of defiance flaring. I'm not leaving you to fight alone, Amos. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. I ain't planning on dying tonight, Delilah, but I need you safe. Those papers are our ticket to bringing Kane down. Her hand brushed his, a fleeting touch that felt like a promise, and she nodded, though her eyes lingered on his, searching as if memorizing the lines of his face. The moment stretched heavy with unspoken words until the creak of a floorboard outside snapped them back to reality. Amos gestured toward the back door, and they moved silently, slipping into the cool night air. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered boards silvered by moonlight. They reached the ridge, a low rise dotted with scrub and boulders, just as the first riders burst into the ranch yard, their lanterns casting wild shadows. Amos pulled Delilah behind a rock, their bodies pressed close in the cramped space, her warmth seeping through his shirt. Her breath was quick, her chest rising and falling against his arm, and for a heartbeat the danger faded, replaced by the awareness of her nearness. The scent of her hair like wildflowers after rain, the softness of her skin where her sleeve had torn. Amos, she whispered, her voice barely audible. If we don't make it, we will. He cut her off, his tone fierce but gentle. He turned to face her, their eyes locking in the dim light. Her lips parted, and he felt the pull, a magnetic force that made him want to close the distance, to taste the courage and fire that defined her. But the crack of a rifle shattered the moment, a bullet, striking the boulder above them, spraying dust. Amos cursed under his breath, pulling her lower. Stay down, he said, his hand lingering on her shoulder, the touch both protective and intimate. He peeked over the rock, counting 5 riders, dismounting, their voices rough as they searched the cabin. Kane's men, no doubt, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. Delilah clutched the strong box, her eyes blazing with determination. We need to keep them away from Billy and the horses, she said. If they find the barn, we're done for. Amos nodded, his mind racing. The ridge gave them a vantage point, but it wouldn't hold against a determined assault. He scanned the terrain, spotting a narrow path that wound down to a dry creek bed. If we can lead them to the creek, we might lose them in the dark, he said. But it's risky. She met his gaze, a spark of mischief in her eyes, despite the danger. I've seen you dodge bullets and arrows, cowboy. Risky's your middle name. He chuckled, the sound low and warm, easing the knot in his chest. Then let's give him something to chase. They moved quickly, keeping low, the strong box tucked under Delilah's arm as they scrambled down the path. The creek bed was a shadowed trench, its banks steep and tangled with roots. Amos helped her down, his hands steady on her waist, and she leaned into him for a moment, her breath catching. The contact was brief, but charged, a silent acknowledgement of the heat building between them, even as death loomed close. They crouched in the creek bed, the sound of the bandits' shouts growing louder as they realized the cabin was empty. Amos's hand found Delilah's, his fingers intertwining with hers, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. When I give the signal, run for the far bank, he whispered. Don't look back. She squeezed his hand, her touch firm. Only if you're right behind me. Before he could respond, a lantern's glow flickered above the creek bed, and a gruff voice called out, They're close, spread out. Amos's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm, his free hand on his revolver. He counted 3 men descending the bank, their boots slipping on the loose dirt, their lanterns casting long, wavering beams. Now Amos hissed, and they bolted, splashing through the shallow creek, the strong box thumping against Delilah's side. A shout went up behind them, followed by the crack of gunfire. Amos fired back his last 2 bullets, finding their mark, sending one man sprawling. Delilah's pistol barked her aim true, and another bandit fell clutching his leg. They reached the far bank, scrambling up the slope, but a new figure loomed ahead, a towering man with a scarred face, his rifle raised. Amos dove in front of Delilah, tackling her to the ground as the rifle fired, the bullet grazing his side, hot and sharp. Pain flared, but he ignored it, rolling to shield her as another shot rang out. Delilah's hands were on him, frantic, checking for blood. Amos, you're hit. Her voice was thick with worry, her fingers brushing the tear in his shirt, warm against his skin. Just a scratch, he grunted, though the pain said otherwise. He pulled her behind a tree, their bodies pressed close, her breath warm against his neck. The moment was fleeting but intense, her nearness, a fire that burned brighter than the pain. You okay? He asked, his voice rough, his hand cupping her cheek. She nodded, her eyes locked on his, her lips so close he could feel their warmth. Thanks to you, she whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that made his heart race faster than any gunfight. The scarred bandit advanced his rifle, reloading with a metallic click. Amos pushed Delilah behind him, drawing his knife, the only weapon he had left. But before the man could fire, a shadow moved in the dark, a Lakota warrior, silent as death, his bow drawn. An arrow flew, striking the bandit in the chest, and he crumpled without a sound. Amos and Delilah froze, their breaths mingling as the warrior stepped into the moonlight, his face the same one from the ridge. He nodded once, then vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving them alone in the creek bed, the night swallowing the sounds of pursuit. Amos helped Delilah to her feet, their hands lingering the air between them, charged with unspoken longing. "We need to keep moving," he said, though his voice was softer now, his thumb brushing her knuckles. She nodded, clutching the strong box, but her eyes held his, a promise in their depths. "You keep saving me, Amos," she said, her voice low, intimate. "I'm starting to think I owe you more than I can repay." He grinned despite the pain, despite the danger. "Just keep those eyes on me, Delilah. That's payment enough." They moved deeper into the night, the strong box, their lifeline, their connection, a flame that burned brighter with every step. Cain's men were still out there, and Devil's Crossing waited at dawn. But for now, in the quiet of the creek bed, Amos and Delilah were bound by something stronger than fear, a spark that promised to ignite no matter what the Wild West threw their way. The Wyoming night wrapped around Amos Tucker and Delilah Rose, like a heavy cloak, the stars above offering little comfort as they moved through the shadowed creek bed, the strong box of evidence clutched tightly in Delilah's arms. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of Amos's blood seeping from the fresh graze on his side. His breath came in shallow bursts, but he kept his pace steady, one hand on his knife, the other, hovering near Delilah, ready to shield her from any threat. Her presence beside him was a quiet fire, her warmth a tether in the darkness. And though neither spoke of it, the fleeting touches and shared glances had woven a bond that pulsed stronger with every step. The Lakota warriors' intervention had given them a moment's reprieve, but the threat of Caleb Cain's men loomed their pursuit, a distant rumble that promised no mercy. They climbed out of the creek bed, the train rising toward a rocky outcrop that overlooked the trail to Devil's Crossing. Dawn was hours away, but Amos knew they couldn't rest, not with Jacob's life hanging in the balance, and Cain's deadline ticking closer. Delilah's face was set with determination, her brown hair tangled but glowing faintly in the moonlight, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion creeping in. She adjusted the strong box, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. "We're close to the crossing," she said, her voice low but steady. "If we can get there before Cain expects us, maybe we can turn the tables." Amos nodded, scanning the horizon. "Cain'll have men watching the pass. We need to scout it first, find a way to slip in without walking into a trap." His side throbbed, but he pushed the pain down, focusing on her. "You sure you're up for this, Delilah? It ain't gonna be pretty." She met his gaze, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I didn't come this far to back down now. Jacob's all I've got left. Besides," she added, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "I've got you, don't I?" Her words hit him like a shot of whiskey, warm and heady, and he couldn't help but grin. "Reckon you do," he said, his voice rough, with something more than just the dust in his throat. But before he could say more, a rustle in the scrub ahead froze them both. Amos's hand shot to his knife, his body tensing as he stepped in front of Delilah. "Show yourself," he called, his voice cutting through the night. The rustle stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a figure stepped into the moonlight. Not a bandit, but a woman, her silhouette slight and her movements cautious. She wore a tattered shawl, her dark hair braided tightly, and her eyes wide and wary locked on Amos's blade. "Don't hurt me," she said, her voice trembling, but clear, tinged with an accent that marked her as Lakota. "I mean no harm. I saw you with my brother the warrior. He sent me." Amos lowered his knife but kept his guard up. "Your brother, the one who saved us back there." She nodded, stepping closer, her hands empty to show she was no threat. "I am Neela. My brother Tala leads our warriors. He said you fight Cain, our enemy. I have news you need." Delilah's eyes narrowed, but she stepped forward, the strong box still clutched tight. "What news, and why should we trust you?" Neela's gaze flicked to the strong box, then back to Delilah, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Because I know who you are, Delilah Rose, and I know why Cain wants you dead. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's not just the papers, it's you. Amos's heart skipped his grip, tightening on the knife. Speak plain, lady. What's Cain after her? For Neela hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if the night itself might be listening. Cain believes you know his secret, a secret he's killed to keep buried. Years ago, he was married to a woman from our people. She fled when she learned what he was, a thief and a murderer. She took something from him, something he's hunted ever since. Delilah's brow furrowed confusion, mixing with unease. What does that have to do with me? Neela's eyes softened, but her words carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. That woman was your mother, Delilah. You're Cain's daughter. The words hit like a thunderclap, stealing the breath from Amos's lungs. Delilah froze, her face paling, the strong box nearly slipping from her grasp. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's impossible. My mother died when I was a baby. My father was a rancher, not him. Neela's voice was gentle but firm. Your mother hid you and your brother from Cain. She left you with the man you called father, a kind man who raised you as his own. But Cain found out. He's been searching for you not just for the evidence Jacob gathered, but because you're his blood. He thinks you know where your mother hid his fortune gold he stole from our people and others. Amos's mind reeled, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. Cain's obsession with Delilah wasn't just about silencing a witness. It was personal, twisted by greed and a warped sense of legacy. He looked at Delilah, expecting her to crumble, but her eyes blazed with a fury that took his breath away. He's no father of mine, she spat, her voice trembling with rage. If what you say is true, he's the monster who destroyed my family. I'll see him in chains before I let him touch me or Jacob. Neela nodded, respect in her gaze. Tala believes you can help us stop him. The papers in that box, they prove Cain's crimes against our people too. But he's closer than you think. His men are already at Devil's Crossing waiting. Amos's gut twisted. The twist of Delilah's lineage was a shock, but the immediate danger snapped him back to focus. How many? He asked, his voice low. 15, maybe more, Neela said. They've got Jacob tied up in a cave at the pass. Cain himself is there waiting for Delilah. Delilah's hands tightened on the strong box, her knuckles white. Then we go to him, she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her eyes. We end this tonight. Amos grabbed her arm, his touch firm but gentle. Hold on. You're walking into a trap, and now we know why. Cain's not just after those papers, he's after you. You go in there, he'll use you to get what he wants. Her eyes met his, fierce and unyielding, but softened by something deeper, something that had grown between them in the heat of battle and the quiet of shared glances. I'm not afraid, Amos, not with you beside me. Her words stirred something in him, a warmth that battled the cold dread in his chest. He wanted to protect her, to pull her away from this madness, but he knew she wouldn't run. Not now, not ever. All right, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But we do this smart. Neela, can your brother help us? Neela nodded. Tala's warriors are nearby watching the pass. They'll strike when the time is right. But you must get to Jacob first. Cain won't hesitate to kill him if he thinks he's lost you. Amos turned to Delilah, his hand still on her arm, his thumb brushing her skin in a gesture that felt both protective and intimate. We'll get your brother out, he said, and we'll make Cain pay for everything. Delilah's gaze held his, a storm of emotions swirling in her eyes, anger, fear, and something softer, something that made his heart ache. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper. Thank you, Amos, for believing in me. Before he could respond, Neela gestured toward the trail. We must move. Dawn is coming and Cain will be ready. They followed her, the strong box, a heavy burden, the weight of Neela's revelation heavier still. Amos stayed close to Delilah, his senses sharp, his heart racing with the knowledge that the woman beside him was more than a fighter, more than a spark in the dark. She was a secret that could topple an outlaw's empire, and he'd be damned if he let Cain claim her. As they neared Devil's Crossing, the night seemed to pulse with danger and possibility, the truth of Delilah's past, a twist that changed everything, setting the stage for a reckoning none of them could predict. The trail to Devil's Crossing wound through a maze of jagged rocks and twisted scrub, the Wyoming night pressing close as Amos Tucker, Delilah Rose, and Neela moved like shadows toward the heart of Caleb Cain's trap. The revelation of Delilah's lineage still hung heavy, a storm cloud over her fierce resolve, but she clutched the strong box of evidence with a grip that dared the world to take it from her. Amos stayed at her side, his knife ready, his side throbbing where the bullet had grazed him, but his focus was on her, her steady breath, her unyielding spirit, the way her brown hair caught the starlight. Neela led the way, her steps silent, her eyes scanning the darkness for signs of her brother Tala's warriors. The air was thick with the promise of violence, but beneath it the unspoken bond between Amos and Delilah pulsed like a heartbeat, a fragile light in the gathering storm. As they neared the pass, the terrain opened into a narrow canyon, its walls looming like sentinels under the moon. Neela raised a hand, signaling them to stop behind a cluster of boulders. "The cave is just ahead," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the faint whistle of the wind. "Cain's men are guarding the entrance. Jacob's inside." Delilah's eyes burned with determination, but her voice trembled slightly. "How many guards?" "4 outside, more within," Neela said. "Tala's warriors will strike soon, but we must get closer to free your brother." Amos nodded, his mind racing. 4 guards were manageable, but the cave was a death trap, tight quarters, no cover, and Cain himself waiting like a spider in its web. He glanced at Delilah, her face pale but set, and felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with something deeper, something that made his chest ache. "We go in quiet," he said. "Take out the guards, get Jacob, and get out before Cain knows we're here." Delilah's lips curved into a wry smile despite the tension. "You make it sound so easy, cowboy." He chuckled, the sound low and warm, easing the knot in his gut. "Stick with me and it just might be." They crept forward, keeping to the shadows, but the plan unraveled faster than a poorly tied knot. A twig snapped under Delilah's boot, the sound sharp in the stillness, and one of the guards, a wiry man with a patchy beard, spun toward them, his rifle raised. "Who's there?" he barked. Amos acted on instinct, lunging from the shadows and tackling the guard before he could fire. The man hit the ground hard, his rifle clattering against the rocks, but his shout alerted the others. Lanterns flared, and 3 more guards charged from the cave's mouth, their guns drawn. Delilah didn't hesitate, her pistol barking, as she dropped one man with a shot to the leg while Neela vanished into the dark, her knife glinting as she moved to flank the others. Chaos erupted, the canyon echoing with gunfire and shouts. Amos wrestled with the wiry guard who fought like a cornered rattler, landing a punch that split Amos's lip. Blood stung his mouth, but he drove his knee into the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him. As the guard slumped, Amos grabbed his rifle, spinning to cover Delilah. She was pinned behind a rock, trading shots with the remaining guards, her aim steady, but her ammunition low. "Delilah, fall back," Amos shouted, firing to keep the guards' heads down. She darted toward him, the strong box tucked under one arm, her skirt catching on a thorn and tearing with a loud rip. She stumbled, and Amos caught her, their bodies colliding in a tangle of limbs. For a heartbeat, they were pressed close, her breath hot against his cheek, her eyes wide with adrenaline, and something else, something that made his pulse race faster than the gunfire. "Nice catch," she gasped, a spark of humor in her voice despite the chaos. "But maybe next time warn me before you play hero." He grinned despite the blood on his lip. "Keep tripping into my arms and I might make it a habit." Before she could retort, a new voice cut through the night, cold and commanding. Enough. Caleb Kane stepped from the cave, his tall frame silhouetted against the flickering lanterns, a revolver in one hand, and Jacob bound and gagged in the other. Delilah's brother was bruised, his eyes wide with fear, but alive. Kane's face was hard, his eyes glinting with a mix of greed and rage as they locked on Delilah. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, girl." Delilah froze, her hand tightening on her pistol, but Amos stepped in front of her, his stolen rifle raised. "Let the boy go, Kane," he growled. "This ends now." Kane's laugh was a low, ugly sound. "You think you can stop me, Tucker? You're a dead man walking." He shoved Jacob forward, using him as a shield, and Amos's heart sank. The guards regrouped, closing in, their guns trained on Amos and Delilah. The situation was dire, but it got worse and more awkward when a misplaced step sent Amos tripping over the fallen guard's rifle, his boot catching the barrel. He stumbled, nearly dropping his own weapon, and landed in a crouch that put him face to face with Delilah's torn skirt, now hiked up to reveal a glimpse of her ankle and a very practical, very dusty petticoat. He froze, his face heating despite the danger, and Delilah's eyes widened, a flush creeping up her cheeks. "Really, Amos," she hissed, yanking her skirt down. "Now's not the time to admire my laundry." He coughed, scrambling to his feet, his grin sheepish. "Didn't mean to, ma'am. Just keeping an eye on the terrain." Her glare was half exasperation, half amusement, but there was no time to dwell on it. Kane's men advanced, and Amos raised the rifle, his humor fading as he calculated their odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped with Jacob's life hanging by a thread. Delilah clutched the strong box, her eyes darting between her brother and Kane, her fury palpable. Then a low whistle pierced the air, a signal. Neela reappeared, her knife flashing as she took down a guard from behind, and shadows moved along the canyon walls. Tala's warriors, silent and swift, descended like wolves, their arrows and blades striking with deadly precision. Kane's men faltered, caught off guard, and Amos seized the moment, firing to cover Delilah as she darted toward Jacob. Kane roared, dragging Jacob back into the cave, his revolver pressed to the boy's temple. "You want him, Delilah. Come and get him," he taunted, disappearing into the darkness. Delilah didn't hesitate, charging after him, the strong box still in her grip. Amos cursed, sprinting to catch up his side, screaming with pain, but his focus razor sharp. The cave was a labyrinth of narrow tunnels, the air damp and heavy with the scent of earth and fear. Lanterns hung sporadically, casting eerie shadows as they pursued Kane, his mocking laughter echoing ahead. They rounded a corner, and there he was, Kane, standing in a wide chamber, Jacob at his feet, the revolver aimed at Delilah. "Drop the box," he snarled, "or your brother's brains paint the walls." Delilah's hand trembled, but her voice was steel. "You're no father to me, Kane. You're a coward who hides behind a gun." Amos edged closer, his rifle steady, but Kane's eyes flicked to him, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You think you're her savior, Tucker. She's my blood, my claim. That gold she's hiding, it's mine." The words hung heavy, the truth of Delilah's past, a wound that cut deeper than any bullet. But she didn't flinch, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You'll get nothing from me," she said, stepping forward, the strong box raised like a weapon. "Not the gold, not my fear." Amos's heart swelled with pride, but the tension was a tightrope, and one wrong move would snap it. He caught Delilah's eye, a silent plan forming. "Keep him talking," he mouthed, easing toward the shadows. Delilah nodded almost imperceptibly, her voice rising. "You want the gold? Then tell me where it is. You think I know, but I don't. Prove you're not just a liar." Kane's eyes narrowed, his grip on the revolver tightening, but her words held him, buying Amos time to slip behind a stalagmite. The cave, the danger, the awkward stumble outside, it all faded, leaving only the need to save her, to save Jacob, to end this. As Kane sneered, starting to speak, Amos lunged, his knife flashing, ready to turn the tide in a final, desperate gamble. Amos Tucker's knife gleamed in the flickering lantern light as he lunged from the shadows of the cave, his body a coiled spring of determination. The air in the cavern was thick heavy with the scent of damp stone and the metallic tang of fear. As Caleb Kane's cruel smile faltered his revolver, still pressed to Jacob's temple. Delilah stood defiant, the strong box of evidence clutched tightly, her eyes locked on Kane's, holding his attention as Amos closed the distance. The moment stretched taut, every heartbeat a thunderclap until Amos's blade found its mark, not to kill, but to disarm, slashing across Kane's wrist with surgical precision. The outlaw roared, his gun clattering to the cave floor, and Jacob seized his chance, scrambling free as Delilah rushed to his side. The chamber erupted into chaos. Kane lunged for his revolver, blood dripping from his wrist. But Amos was faster, tackling him to the ground with a force that echoed off the walls. They grappled, fists flying, the outlaw's strength fueled by rage, but no match for Amos's resolve. Delilah untied Jacob, her hands trembling, but steady, her brother's bruised face lighting up with relief as he hugged her fiercely. Outside, the sounds of Tala's warriors clashing with Kane's remaining men filled the air, arrows whistling, shouts fading as the tide turned. Amos pinned Kane, his knee on the outlaw's chest, his knife at his throat. "It's over, Kane," he growled, his voice rough with exhaustion but unwavering. "You've lost." Kane's eyes blazed with defiance, but the fight was draining from him, his men scattered or dead, his empire crumbling. "You think you've won," he spat, his gaze flicking to Delilah. "She's my blood. She'll never be free of me." Delilah stepped forward, the strong box under one arm, her pistol in hand. Her voice was steel-tempered by a lifetime of resilience. "You're nothing to me, Kane. My family is the man who raised me, the brother I fought for, and the people who stood by me." Her eyes met Amos's, a spark of gratitude and something deeper passing between them. "You don't get to claim me." Before Kane could respond, Tala and his warriors entered the chamber, their presence a silent storm. The Lakota leader's face was stern, his bow lowered but ready. "This man has spilled our blood, stolen our lives," Tala said, his voice low and commanding. "He will face our justice." Amos nodded, stepping back, as Tala's men bound Kane's hands, their movements swift and unyielding. Delilah handed the strongbox to Neela, who had joined her brother, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "These papers," Delilah said, "they prove Kane's crimes against your people and mine. Take them to the marshal in Cheyenne. End this for all of us." Neela took the box, her gaze steady. "You have our thanks," Delilah rose. "You are strong like our women. Your mother would be proud." The mention of her mother softened Delilah's expression, a flicker of pain and peace crossing her face. She nodded, unable to speak, as Jacob leaned against her, his arm around her shoulders. Amos watched them, his heart full, but heavy, the weight of their shared ordeal settling into his bones. His side ached, his lips still bled, but none of it mattered. They were alive. They were free. As Tala's warriors led Kane away, the cave grew quiet, the lanterns casting long shadows across the stone. Amos holstered his knife, his eyes finding Delilah's. She stepped toward him, Jacob trailing behind, and for a moment the world shrank to just the two of them. "You kept your promise," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "You got us through." He shrugged, a half smile tugging at his lips despite the pain. "Told you I would, didn't?" She laughed, a sound like clear water over stones, and reached out her fingers, brushing the cut on his lip. The touch was gentle, intimate, sending a warmth through him that no whiskey ever could. "You're a mess, Amos Tucker," she said, her eyes sparkling. "But I reckon you're my kind of mess." Jacob cleared his throat, his grin awkward but genuine. I'm still here, you know," Amos chuckled, stepping back, his face heating. "Sorry, kid. Got carried away." Delilah swatted her brother's arm, her cheeks flushed. "Hush, Jacob. Let me have my moment." The three of them emerged from the cave into the pre-dawn light, the Wyoming sky streaked with pink and gold. Tala and his warriors had vanished, taking Cain and his men to face justice, leaving the canyon quiet save for the soft nickering of horses. Billy, the nervous ranch hand, appeared from the barn, his eyes wide as he saw Jacob safe. "You did it," he stammered, rushing to hug Jacob, who groaned but hugged him back. The ride back to the ranch was slow, the weight of the night lifting with every mile. Delilah rode beside Amos. Their horses closed their silence, comfortable but charged with unspoken promises. Jacob and Billy trailed behind, swapping stories of the ordeal, their voices a soft hum in the morning air. When they reached the ranch, the sun was rising, painting the plains in hues of fire and hope. Delilah dismounted, turning to Amos as he slid from Rusty's saddle. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady, her eyes searching his. "You're a drifter, Amos. Will the wind take you away again?" He looked at her, at the strength in her stance, the softness in her gaze, and felt something shift inside him, a root taking hold where none had grown before. "Reckon the wind's blowing me right here," he said, his voice low earnest. "If you'll have me." Her smile was like the sunrise, warm and radiant, and she stepped closer, her hand finding his. "I'd like that," she said, her voice a promise, "but only if you promise to clean up that blood first." He laughed, the sound deep and free, and pulled her close, mindful of Jacob's watchful eye. The embrace was brief but fierce, a vow sealed in the dust of the Wild West. Jacob rolled his eyes but grinned, and Billy busied himself with the horses, muttering about needing a drink. The days that followed were a blur of rebuilding, repairing the ranch, sending the strongbox evidence to Cheyenne, and watching Cain's empire crumble under the weight of justice. Tala's people found peace, their stolen lands acknowledged, their voices heard. But for Amos and Delilah, the true victory was quieter, built in stolen glances and shared laughter, in the way her hand fit in his, in the way his scars told a story of sacrifice for her. The Wild West was a harsh land, unforgiving and wild, but it was also a place where hearts could mend, where love could grow like wildflowers through cracked earth. Amos Tucker, once a drifter with no roots, had found his home in Delilah Rose. Her heart, his prize, her strength, his anchor. And as they stood together on the ranch's porch, watching the sun set over the plains, they knew that whatever storms came next, they'd face them side by side, their love a beacon stronger than any arrow or bullet. If you find it interesting, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Thank you very much.